Oral questions. Questions are Honorable Andrew Scheer.
9 years of this NDP Liberal Prime Minister's economic vandalism. Over 2 million Canadians are visiting a food bank in a single month. Housing costs have doubled, and inflation continues to eat away at Canadians' paychecks. His massive deficits and tax hikes are causing extreme damage to the Canadian economy. For 8 out of the last 9 quarters, Canadian per-person GDP is down. This is a made-in-Canada, per-person GDP recession. That means Canadian workers work harder but bring home less. So will the Prime Minister stop his economic vandalism and cancel his job-killing, paycheck-shrinking tax hikes?
Yes.
The Honourable Minister for Indigenous Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning we heard the sad news of the passing of the Honourable Murray Sinclair. Let me take a moment before we begin today to say a few words about him. As a former judge, senator, and chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Murray was determined to help Canada reckon with its colonial realities and bring healing to this country. He was a visionary and a leader, and his kind and fierce commitment to truth has pushed Canada forward in profound and lasting ways. Our hearts and minds are with his family, and Canada is a much better place for his service.
Okay.
The Honourable Member from Regina Capel.
I join in my honourable colleagues' sending of condolences, but we are witnessing economic vandalism in real time. Last Thursday, this government was briefed that the only sector of the Canadian economy actually producing any growth was the energy sector. And what did they do today? They slapped a punishing cap on Canadian production.
Exactly.
All this will do is chase investments and jobs to other countries. But that's something this Prime Minister is good at. He's increased Canadian investment into the U.S. by $63 billion last year alone. So will the Prime Minister stop fueling the U.S. economy, cancel his tax hikes, and cancel the production cap to bring those investment dollars back home?
Yeah, we need to invest in the Canadian economy.
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources and Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, we were very pleased to announce an emissions cap with respect to the oil and gas sector in this country. Given that oil and gas constitutes 31% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, it is important that we work with the sector to reduce emissions, just as we do with every sector. It is also true that as we move towards a lower carbon economy across the world, oil and gas produced with the lowest emissions is actually going to have value around the world. We are moving forward with a plan to address climate change and build a strong economy going forward. They are stuck in the past and ignoring the science of climate.
No. Taxes aren't going to fix the weather, dude.
Member, just going to ask the Honourable Member from Calgary Centre, please, to hold on until his question is turned to ask a question. The Honourable Member from Regina Capel.
All this production cap will do is make other countries richer while making Canadians poorer. But that's something this Prime Minister is so good at. Consider this, GDP per capita in Canada, down. In the U.S., it's up. 9 years ago, average wages in the U.S. and Canada were almost identical. Now, an American worker brings home $22,000 more than their Canadian counterpart. And $500 billion in investments has fled Canada to the United States, creating bigger paychecks for American workers, all because of this Prime Minister's high taxes and massive deficits. The Prime Minister is the #1 job creator in the United States. So instead of helping the Canadian economy, why not fight for Canada for once?
There you go. Why is it so hard to be pro-Canadian and a politician?
Climate change.
Mr. Speaker, maybe the member opposite should take the time to actually read the information about the pollution cap. Production is forecast to increase 16% by 2030, Mr. Speaker. So this idea that we're somehow cutting production is simply not true.
The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, after 9 years and 3 American presidents, this Prime Minister has failed to renegotiate the softwood lumber agreement. He failed where the previous Conservative Prime Minister succeeded, and that just 90 days after being elected. After the closing of the sawmill in Maniwaki and in Mauricie, we now learned that another sawmill is about to close its doors in Quebec. Why are the Liberals continuing to abandon forestry workers?
The
Honourable Minister of Exports and International Development, Trade.
Hey! way.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I want to
It's a
thank
traitor.
for that question. As he well knows,
She's named
the Forestry
as
industry
Chinese
is
interference.
really important in creating thousands and thousands of jobs across this country. We've been working very hard with the forestry industry, but what I've also learned from the sector is that they're really looking to expand into new markets, and I'm very pleased that our government, the Trade Commissioner Service, is really helping them to access new markets, while at the same time working to continue to try to get a deal with the United States.
Where's my foreign interference whistle?
The honourable member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, I'll say it again, 3 American presidents. And 9 years later, this Liberal Prime Minister has still not managed to renegotiate a
I don't get it.
agreement.
I don't know how she's still standing.
And a clear lack of leadership. 3 sawmills have closed their doors in just a few months. The most recent in Saint-Luger-de-Millau. It's a village of 600 people. 100 of those people are about to lose their jobs. When will there be elections so that our leader can succeed where this Prime Minister has lamentably failed?
The Honourable Minister.
Goes again.
Trade.
I need my traitor whistle.
Those wonderful workers
My Chinese
sector that they
foreign interference.
they
Tweet.
contribute tremendously, not only to the economy of Quebec, but certainly to the economy of Canada. But I do have a question for the member opposite, and that is for his leader. And why is the leader not going to get his security clearance so that he can protect Canadians?
Yeah, you would like that, wouldn't you?
The Honourable Member from Burnaby South.
In Canada, we believe healthcare should be there when you need it, and it should be free. Today,
Then why am I still sick, Jagmeet?
was quoted saying that patients are typically told, I can do your surgery in 14 months. If you come to my private clinic, I can get it done in 1 month. It'll cost you $25,000. Dr. Gourdeau says that's questionable, if not illegal. I think it's pretty clearly illegal. Does the Prime Minister agree?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Public, universal, available for all, and most of all, making sure
Shut up.
pay. That we ensure in our country that when people
You don't even have
care,
the
that they're
option to
taken,
pay.
care of on the
This
basis
is communism.
not the size of their bank account. That's what distinguishes us from so many countries in the world. That is a principle that we stand up proudly for. I would suggest to the leader of the NDP, we've worked well together on things from pharmacare to dental care. There are many different challenges the provinces are presenting to health care right now, and certainly this party opposite, the Conservatives that would seek to ravage our health care system. Let's work together to make sure we protect it.
After 9 years of these NDP Liberals, almost 50% of young Canadians believe they will never own a home. This Liberal housing accelerator is an absolute joke. Common sense Conservatives have a plan. They're going to axe the GST on new home builds. On an $800,000 house, this will save $40,000. Wow. And the Conservative leader has now written to the premiers of every province asking them to match this tax cut. When will these NDP Liberals finally get it through their heads? They're funding bureaucracies, axe the tax on new builds so young people can buy a house.
There you go.
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
He says the Housing Accelerator Fund is a joke, Mr. Speaker. Has he consulted with his caucus? A dozen, probably more, Conservative members have advocated specifically for that program. They went behind the back of the Leader of the Opposition because they wanted to advocate for their constituents to see more homes built. By calling for the end of the Housing Accelerator Fund, which is how they would pay for this new bold idea, so-called, they would end support to communities for homelessness. They would end support for more building for middle-class Canadians. Mr. Speaker, it's an unacceptable, untenable position.
The Honourable Member from Dufferin-Caledon.
Oh man, here's what Liberal housing advisor Mike P. Moffat said about the Liberal Housing Accelerator. Can anyone in the federal government tell me why Toronto deserves $471 million in housing accelerator funds to massively hike development taxes? And housing starts in Toronto are down 20%. Even Liberal advisors know the housing accelerator's a joke. Will these NDP Liberals finally realize they're funding bureaucracy bureaucracies, tripling development charges, and not getting any houses built for young Canadians.
Yeah.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
About young Canadians, he talks about home building in Canada, Mr. Speaker. They have 6 homes to point to when they were in office.
No, they don't.
That's the sum total of their work when they were in office, when the Leader of the Opposition held the so-called role of Minister of Housing. He wasn't a minister at all, Mr. Speaker. In fact, if you look at
They
the
just blatantly lie.
190,000 number that they talk about during their time in office, that was home builders who did that, Mr. Speaker. It was not them. They know nothing about getting homes built. They know only about cuts. They would only make cuts to communities. It's not an acceptable position, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Parry Sound, Muskoka.
After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, we know they're not worth the cost of housing. So bad is their record, in fact, that 80% of young Canadians believe that home ownership is only for the very rich. Conservatives will axe the federal sales tax on new homes sold under $1 million, saving Canadians up to $50,000 or $2,200 a year in mortgage payments. The Conservative leader has written premiers asking them to match our Conservative plan to axe the tax on housing, saving Canadians thousands more. This means real relief for young Canadians desperately trying to buy a home. Will the NDP Liberals axe the tax on housing so young Canadians can finally buy a home?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
Mr. Speaker, I worked with the Honourable Member on the House of Commons committee that's responsible for housing. He almost always brings up good points, except today there's a credibility issue at stake, Mr. Speaker. When he was Mayor of Huntsville, prior to becoming Member of Parliament, he increased development charges, which we agree are an impediment to home building. They are a tax on home building. How much did he increase development charges, Mr. Speaker? Not by 2 or 3%, Mr. Speaker, but by 16%, Mr. Speaker. They can't speak about these issues. They have.
The Liberals are alive. Look at that. They're making K-pop TV noises. Oh.
Order. The Honourable Member from Parry Sound, Muskoka.
Well, Mr. Speaker, when I was on council, we actually cut development charges by 50%, and I also knew as a mayor that if you get bureaucracy out of the way, you get more homes built. These guys don't understand that, though.
And you only need to build affordable housing when houses are unaffordable.
Cities all across this country.
So it's a massive L
Charges and housing
for the Liberals, no matter how you look at it.
Common sense plan will save Canadians up to $50,000 on a new home. This is real relief for Canadians. So why can't they get on board and axe the tax on new homes?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, like former Conservatives, people like Joe Clark, for example, I recognize that Canada is a community of communities. And as an urban-based MP, I want to assure the Honourable Member opposite that I read the Huntsville Doppler, the newspaper of record in this community. He increased development charges by 16%. It was reported time and again in that newspaper, Mr. Speaker. They want to cut support for communities. They want to cut support for housing. Don't be fooled. The Leader of the Opposition ditched his glasses. Same guy that wants to cut pensions, support for housing, support for young people, support for EI. They're not serious, Mr. Speaker.
What do his glasses have anything to do with it?
After 9 years of these NDP Liberals, they are not worth the cost of housing. 50% of young Canadians have abandoned the dream of buying a home one day. Rent, mortgage, and down payment costs have all doubled. Common sense Conservatives will axe the federal sales tax on new homes sold. On an $800,000 house, this will save home buyers $40,000 or $2,200 a year in mortgage payments. Our plan means more housing for young Canadians desperately trying to enter the housing market for the first time. Will the NDP Liberals axe the GST on housing for more young Canadians so they can finally buy a home?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, as we've seen, the Conservatives continue to say that they'll make cuts to pay for their proposals, including this GST initiative, so-called. So what will that mean? It means the Accelerator Fund will come to an end. The member is from Kelowna. A few weeks ago, I met with Kelowna's Mayor Tom Dias, who shared with me that federal funding secured through the Housing Accelerator Fund has led to a digital permit system that's improved approvals that would have taken even a year ago, a year and a half plus to approve. That approval permit process now is less than 10 days, Mr. Speaker. Huge change.
So are they saying that reducing permit times is good?
Well, even the Liberal housing advisor, Mike P. Moffat, on the failed Liberal housing plan said the federal Liberals have lost the plot. Habitat for Humanity said reducing GST would reduce costs. Canadian Home Builders Association said
If the Liberals reduce the GST, they would be admitting
said this proposed
that there's a housing crisis.
move forward, lowering building costs, increasing housing supplies, and making home ownership more attainable for Canadians. Will the NDP Liberals axe the GST on housing so more young Canadians can finally buy a home?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Leader of the Government in the House of Commons.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the simple answer is the Conservative policy on housing is a dud. That's the bottom line, Mr. Speaker. And let me tell you about an issue that Canadians are truly concerned about. You have the leader of the Conservative Party that continues to refuse to get a security clearance. I believe Canadians have a right to know why it is that the Conservative leader refuses to get it. What is he hiding? Is there something about his past that Canadians should know about? It's time the leader step up and be honest with Canadians.
The Honourable Member from...
What a weird take that is.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of NDP Liberals, they are simply not worth the cost of housing. There are encampments all over the city of Abbotsford, including our beloved Cenotaph. Young people are feeling hopeless, knowing that even with a good salary, they will not be able to afford a new house. Conservatives understand that, and that's why we've proposed to a federal GST on new homes, a tax cut that will spark 30,000 new developments. Will the NDP Liberals axe the federal GST on housing so more young Canadians can finally buy a home?
There you go. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
They want to pay for this idea by slashing the Housing Accelerator Fund. So let's understand what that means, Mr. Speaker. This is support for communities across the country, large and small. Support for communities to get people off the street and into homes.
Cut the GST,
for zoning
dummy.
changes that will allow for more building. Giving young people, the ones that they talk about and claim to care about here today, more options. You give people more options, the the costs come down, Mr. Speaker. Infrastructure support, so that water connections, for example, can be connected to housing. They don't believe in that either. Support for vacant buildings to be converted into housing, Mr. Speaker. All of this is on the table.
The member from Bay of Quinte.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of this Liberal NDP government, Canada has become the caboose to America's high-flying economic engine. The GDP per capita has become so stark that the average American worker is now making $22,000 more than the Canadian worker. Why? Well, because Americans don't pay a carbon tax. They don't have high fly-raising capital gains taxes. And they don't have soft trade policies. So when will this Prime Minister finally admit that his high taxes, soft trade policies have derailed Canadian prosperity, or is he content in keeping Canadian workers riding in the back in the caboose?
Good question. The Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker,
I can't do it.
May have an inferiority complex
Speaker.
vis-a-vis the United States, but I sure don't. Let me tell you what's better in Canada. Inflation is lower. Interest rates are lower. We live 4 years longer because we have a universal single-payer healthcare system. And you know what? Investors are noticing the Canadian advantage. Here's what David Rosenberg said last week. U.S.-based investors should strongly consider moving from New York to Toronto because returns here are better, too.
Dude, there's like 10 million Canadians that don't have doctors.
Amazing, Mr. Speaker, because the Liberal candidate Mark Carney moved his company to New York. But let me tell you what's actually happening in the Canadian economy. 90,000 jobs have been lost since 2015 in the softwood lumber industry. 90,000 jobs, 40,000 of them in BC alone. The last Prime Minister figured the softwood lumber deal in 79 days. It's been 9 years and 3 U.S. presidents. How many jobs have to be chopped before he figures out, this Prime Minister figures out that high taxes and a weak, soft spine won't bring jobs back and paychecks to Canadians and across the softwood lumber industry?
That's good. Here we go.
Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker,
I'm too sick still.
We will take no lessons from these weak Conservatives when it comes to standing up for the Canadian national interest. And that's because we remember the 232 steel and aluminum interests. that the U.S. imposed on us. And when we did that, we retaliated. We had the guts to do that. And you know what the Conservatives said? They urged us to back down. They said that retaliation was dumb. They would sell Canadian interests out again in a minute. We will never do that.
After 9 years of NDP Liberals, taxes are up, costs are up, crime is up, and time is up. The cost of the carbon tax is sending record numbers of Canadians to food banks. But food banks are struggling with the carbon tax too. For one Alberta food bank, paying the carbon tax means that there is $280,000 less food for those who are going hungry. This Prime Minister's policies are hurting the most vulnerable and those who work to help them. So will the Prime Minister finally call a carbon tax election so Conservatives can fix what he broke?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Leader of the Government.
Mr. Speaker, we all know that the leader of the Conservative Party had a flip-flop when it came to the price on pollution. But where we're really disappointed is that we have a leader of the Conservative Party who refuses
to get his security clearance
interest ahead of his personal interest and the interest of the Conservative Party. It's time that the Conservative leader step up to the plate and get the security clearance that's needed, Mr. Speaker, in dealing with foreign interference. What is he hiding, Mr. Speaker? He needs to be transparent. He has to tell us about his past. There's something there he needs to tell Canadians, Mr. Speaker.
That's such a weird take.
The Honourable Member from Banff Airdrie.
What an insult that is to Canadians who are going hungry.
Yeah.
And that's not only that, but it's Veterans Week, and there's far too many of the heroes who bravely serve Canada who now cannot count on sitting down to their next meal. In fact, food insecurity amongst veterans has gotten so bad due to the NDP Liberal carbon tax that some legions are having to divert the funds from their poppy campaigns to instead help keep the local food banks afloat. So when will the Prime Minister call a carbon tax election so common sense Conservatives can ensure that veterans finally get the respect that they deserve?
Man, the Legion is really good at helping people out.
Here to the Leader of the Government in the House of Commons.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, let me tell you what an insult is. When you have the leader of the Conservative Party continuing to...
Legion helped me out back in the day.
...personal interest and the interests of the Conservative Party, Mr. Speaker. Let's be clear. The leader of the Conservative Party is hiding something. There's something about his past that he does not want Canadians to know. Mr. Speaker, there is an obligation for the leader of the Conservative Party to come clean and tell Canadians what it is that he's hiding. Why won't he get that security clearance?
That's so weird. He's shushing instead of muting. We did it.
Order.
Oh, he stopped muting the mic.
The Honourable Member from Moose Jaw, Lake Centre, Lanigan.
Mr. Speaker, costs are up, crime is up, and time is up. Moose Jaw's Food Bank faced a temporary closure due to rising costs of food and lack of donations this summer.
Oh my God.
People facing temporary hardship were the ones that used the food bank. Now, it's people with good jobs being forced to use the food bank because the cost of everything has gone up. Mr. Speaker, when will this Prime Minister call a carbon tax election so people can put something under the tree and on their table this Christmas?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Innovation.
Well, I'm glad to hear the member opposite use the word security again. You know, what this House should be preoccupied with, and that all Canadians are preoccupied
Wreck-It Ralph. That's who he reminds me of. Just a big dummy.
as to why the Conservative
Watch that this weekend.
will not get his security clearance. It's been months and months and months. This House has been preoccupied with foreign interference, and yet the Conservative leader won't step up and do the very...
He should be put on an 18-month wait list for
this House have done, which is to
CAT scan, because I feel like he's got some brain damage. By the way he talks.
Member from Thornhill.
Two hardened criminals, a stolen car, and a police chase.
It's not the plot of a blockbuster movie. It's daily life in Canada after 9 years of this Prime Minister. This weekend, the Toronto police officers...
Props to her for saying Blockbuster instead of Netflix.
But not before the crooks injured a horse, rammed a bunch of vehicles, destroyed a business, and put innocent shoppers in danger. We know that both offenders were out on bail thanks to the Liberal NDP capture police policy that has made this country more dangerous for victims and more lenient for criminals. So why was this government putting police and the public at risk instead of putting criminals in jail where they belong?
Repeat offenders. Who would have thought?
That member talks a big game, but when it comes to GTA politics, let's actually assess what police officers are saying. The Deputy Chief of Police in York Region has said, if you actually want to get tough on bail, you need to support the courts, the crowns, and fix the detention centers. Guess who has jurisdiction over all of that? The member from Thornhill should know that's the province. You want to get tough on dealing with bail? Let's have the province support criminal justice in this country and keep our communities safe.
No, members are very passionate about many issues. I'm going to ask the member from Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou, as well as the member from Sarnia-Lambton, please, not to take the mic unless recognized by the chair. The honourable member from Thornhill.
That answer is offensive to every single police officer who puts their life on the line and offensive to every single Canadian who has been a victim of violent crime. Last year, 8 police officers were killed in just 7 months, and violent crime has gone up 30%. Scenes like the one from downtown Toronto are no longer extraordinary. They're becoming the norm under his watch. Provincial governments, municipalities, police associations said they all want change, but the minister responds with that, whatever that was. His recklessness is turning criminals out onto the streets and putting the public at risk. Why is he the only one that doesn't see it?
Yeah. Put a W down for Melissa.
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Let's listen to police officers. Here's the Deputy Chief of York Region. There's just not simply enough court space to hold contested bail hearings. Let's listen to the National Police Federation, who pointed out, newsflash, that when you have JPs with no legal training, sometimes there may be some issues with their rendering of decisions and keeping our community safe. Where do they train JPs legally before they appoint them? Nova Scotia. Maybe that's a lesson that Doug Ford could take. If she needs it in a 3-word slogan, here it is. Talk to the Premier.
Is that a bald spot on the back of his head?